The sound of ATV engines tearing through my peaceful morning shattered 20 years of tranquility in a single moment. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee cup trembling in my hands, as I watched Karen and her crew rip through the trails I had spent decades carefully maintaining. Mud flew everywhere. My prize-winning wildflowers were crushed under spinning tires. The wooden bridge my grandfather built with his own hands splintered under the weight of machines that had no business being on my private property. Karen saw me watching and had the audacity to wave, her smug smile visible even from a distance. She gunned her engine harder, sending chunks of earth flying into the creek where I used to find peace every morning. That was the moment I realized that being reasonable would never work with someone who respected nothing and no one. That was also the moment I decided to teach her exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong ranch owner. For 23 years, I had lived what most people would call the perfect life. My ranch stretched across 400 acres of rolling hills, oak groves, and pristine meadows in rural Texas. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of birds singing and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. The air was clean, the sky was wide, and the closest neighbor was nearly a mile away. The crown jewel of my property was the trail system I had developed over the decades. These were not just dirt paths carved carelessly through the landscape. Each trail had been planned, cleared, and maintained with the love and attention of someone who understood that land was not just something you owned, but something you stewarded for future generations. The main trail wound through a grove of century-old oak trees, their massive branches creating a natural cathedral that filtered sunlight into dancing patterns on the ground below. Another path followed the creek that ran along the southern border of my property, offering peaceful spots where you could sit and watch the water flow over smooth stones. A third trail climbed gently to the highest point on my land, where you could see for miles across the valley. I had built these trails for horseback riding primarily. My mare Stella and I would spend hours exploring every corner of the property. The trails were also perfect for quiet walks, especially in the evening when the Texas heat finally broke and the world seemed to exhale with relief. I had installed benches at scenic overlooks, planted wildflower seeds along the pathways, and even built a small wooden bridge over the creek using reclaimed timber from an old barn. These trails held memories that money could not buy. My late wife Sarah and I had walked them together every anniversary. My daughter took her first pony ride along the Oak Grove Trail when she was 6 years old. When Sarah was fighting cancer, the trails became our sanctuary, the place where we could forget about hospitals and treatments and just be together in the beauty of the natural world. The Rural Homeowners Association that governed our area had always been reasonable and respectful. Unlike the horror stories you hear about suburban HOAs with their ridiculous rules about grass height and mailbox colors, our HOA existed mainly to maintain the gravel roads and coordinate with the county on matters like fire prevention and water rights. The board members were all local ranchers and farmers who understood that rural life was different from city life. We had lived in harmony for over 2 decades. Property lines were respected. Noise was kept to reasonable levels. When someone needed help with a sick animal or a broken fence, neighbors showed up without being asked. It was the kind of community that restored your faith in humanity. But change was coming, whether we wanted it or not. Over the past few years, the city had been expanding outward, and suburban developments were creeping closer to our rural haven. With them came new residents who had different ideas about what country living should look like. Most of the newcomers adapted well and came to appreciate the slower pace and natural beauty of rural life. But not everyone who moves to the country truly understands what they are signing up for. Some people bring their city expectations with them, expecting rural areas to transform into suburban playgrounds designed for their convenience. They see open space and think it exists for their personal entertainment, not understanding the decades of careful stewardship that preserves these places. As I sipped my morning coffee and watched the sun rise over my peaceful domain, I had no idea that one of these newcomers was already making plans that would turn my sanctuary into a battlefield. I had no idea that someone was looking at my carefully maintained trails and seeing nothing but free recreational opportunities. I could not have imagined that the peace I had worked so hard to create was about to be shattered by someone who believed that her wants mattered more than my rights. The storm was coming, and I was completely unprepared for the devastation it would bring. Karen Miller arrived in our community like a hurricane disguised as a gentle breeze. At first glance, she seemed pleasant enough. She and her husband had purchased the old Henderson Place, a modest ranch house on 20 acres about 2 miles from my property. They were empty nesters from Dallas, she explained to anyone who would listen, looking for a quieter lifestyle now that their kids were grown and gone. The first red flag appeared at Karen's very first HOA meeting. She showed up with a folder full of printed documents and a laptop computer, which was already unusual for our informal gatherings that typically took place around someone's kitchen table. She had clearly done her homework, studying our bylaws and regulations with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for trial. "I have some concerns about the way things are being managed around here," she announced, not even waiting for the proper introduction that was customary for new members. Her voice carried the crisp confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "There are outdated practices that need to be modernized if we want to protect our property values." The existing board members exchanged glances. Our HOA president, Jim Rodriguez, had been ranching in the area for 40 years. He cleared his throat politely. "What kind of practices are you concerned about, Mrs. Miller?" Corinne opened her folder with theatrical precision. "Well, for starters, there are livestock operations that are not properly contained. I can smell the Hendricks cattle from my property line. There are also various structures that would never pass inspection in a proper planned community." She was talking about barns, chicken coops, and equipment sheds that had been part of the landscape for decades. These were working ranches, not suburban neighborhoods with manicured lawns and restrictions on storage buildings. "Ma'am," Jim said with patience that came from years of dealing with difficult situations, "this is a rural area. We have different standards here because we have different needs. Ranching and farming require certain accommodations." Corinne's smile was sharp as a blade. "I understand that, Mr. Rodriguez, but I also understand that property values are important to all of us. I am not asking for unreasonable changes. I am simply suggesting that we bring our community standards into the 21st century." Over the following weeks, Corinne made it her mission to introduce herself to every property owner in the HOA. She was charming and persuasive, speaking in terms of community improvement and protecting investments. She had a talent for making people feel like their concerns were important while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about the way things had always been done. She targeted newer residents first, people who were still finding their place in the community. She spoke to them about property values and modern standards, painting a picture of gradual decline that would eventually affect everyone. She was careful never to attack anyone directly, instead focusing on abstract concepts like progress and responsible development. But her true nature revealed itself when she discovered my trail system. I was working in my garden one morning when I saw an unfamiliar figure walking along my fence line. Corinne had apparently decided to take a nature walk that just happened to bring her to the boundary of my property. She stood there for several minutes, clearly studying the trails that were visible from the road. The next day, she knocked on my door with a plate of cookies and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I hope you do not mind my dropping by," she said, stepping inside before I could properly invite her in. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I am Karen Miller, your new neighbor." We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, but I could tell she had an agenda. Her eyes kept wandering toward the back of my property, where the trail system began. "You have such a beautiful piece of land," she said finally. "Those trails look so well maintained. It must be wonderful to have such recreational opportunities right in your backyard." Something in her tone made me cautious. "Thank you. I have been working on them for over 20 years. 20 years, she repeated, as if the number was significant. "And they are just for your personal use." "That is correct. They are on my private property." Karen nodded, but her expression had changed subtly. The friendly neighbor mask was slipping, revealing something calculating underneath. Of course. Though I do wonder if there might be opportunities for the broader community to enjoy such beautiful trails. It seems almost selfish to keep such natural beauty hidden away. The word selfish hit me like a slap. These trails were my sanctuary, my legacy, my gift to the land itself. The idea that maintaining them for my own peaceful enjoyment was somehow wrong left me speechless. Karen must have sensed my reaction, because she quickly backtracked. "Oh, I do not mean to suggest anything inappropriate. I am just thinking out loud about community resources and shared spaces." She left shortly after that, but not before taking one last long look at my trails. As I watched her drive away, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I had the distinct feeling that I had just been scouted by someone who was already planning an invasion. 3 weeks later, I discovered what Karen had really been planning during her reconnaissance mission to my property. I was in my barn, feeding the horses, when I heard the unmistakable sound of ATV engines roaring to life somewhere nearby. The noise was loud, aggressive, and completely out of place in our quiet rural setting. I walked outside to investigate and felt my blood pressure spike immediately. Karen Miller was leading a convoy of 3 ATVs directly onto my property, using the gate that opened onto the county road. She was not alone. Her husband was driving one machine, and 2 other adults I did not recognize were on the remaining vehicles. They were heading straight for my trail system. I ran toward them, waving my arms and shouting, "Hey, this is private property. You cannot be here." Karen saw me coming and actually had the nerve to wave back cheerfully, as if I was greeting them rather than telling them to get out. She drove her ATV right up to where I was standing and shut off the engine. "Good morning," she called out with fake enthusiasm. "We were just taking advantage of these beautiful trails. They are absolutely perfect for ATVs." "These are private trails on private property," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building inside me. "You need to leave immediately." Karen's expression shifted to one of confused innocence. "Oh, I am sorry. I thought these were community trails. They are so well maintained and obviously designed for recreational use." "They are designed for horseback riding and walking. They are on my land. You are trespassing." "Trespassing?" Karen laughed as if I had said something amusing. "That seems like a very strong word for neighbors enjoying shared outdoor space." The other riders had shut off their engines and were listening to our conversation. I could see them looking around at my trails, my bridges, my carefully placed benches, and I realized they were evaluating the property like shoppers in a store. "This is not shared space," I said firmly. This is my property that I have developed and maintained at my own expense for over 20 years. You need to leave now, and you need to not come back." Karen's husband, a thin man with a weak chin who had not said a word during the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. "The trails connect to the county road. That makes them public access." I stared at him in disbelief. The fact that my driveway connects to the county road does not make my house public property. The same logic applies to my trails. But Karen was already restarting her engine. "We will have to agree to disagree on this one," she said over the noise. "I think you will find that community recreational resources are more complex than simple property ownership." They drove off before I could respond, but not before they had torn up a section of the Oak Grove Trail with their spinning tires and left deep ruts in the soft earth near the creek. The damage was not extensive, but it was intentional. They had marked their territory like animals. I spent the rest of the day researching property law and HOA regulations, trying to understand how Karen thought she could justify what she had done. I found nothing that supported her position. My trails were clearly on my property, maintained at my expense, and had never been designated as community resources. But Karen was not interested in legal technicalities. 3 days later, they were back. This time, they brought friends. 6 ATVs roared onto my property in the early afternoon when they knew I would be out checking on my cattle. I heard them from half a mile away and raced back to the house on horseback, my heart pounding with anger and disbelief. By the time I arrived, they had already done significant damage. The wooden bridge over the creek had deep gouges from ATV tracks. Several of my carefully planted wildflower areas had been churned into mud. Worst of all, they had knocked over one of the benches I had built as a memorial to my late wife. This time, Karen was ready for my protests. "Before you start yelling about trespassing," she said as I approached, "you should know that I have been reviewing the HOA bylaws very carefully. There are provisions for community access to recreational facilities that benefit the broader neighborhood." "Show me," I demanded. She pulled out her phone and began reading from what sounded like a legal document. Section 4(2)(7) states that recreational facilities that enhance community value may be subject to reasonable access provisions when such access serves the general welfare of HOA members. It was complete nonsense. She was either making it up or deliberately misinterpreting language that applied to completely different situations. But she was reading it with such authority that the other riders were nodding along as if it made perfect sense. "That section applies to community pools and shared recreational buildings," I said, "not private property." "We will see about that," Karen replied. "I am calling for a formal review of this matter at the next HOA meeting." They left, but the damage was done. My sanctuary had been violated, my property had been destroyed, and Karen had served notice that she intended to turn my private trails into her personal playground. The war had officially begun, and I was completely unprepared for the level of ruthlessness I was about to face. The HOA meeting that Karen had demanded took place the following Tuesday evening at the community center. I arrived early, armed with property deeds, survey maps, and photographs of the damage to my trails. I was confident that any reasonable person would see that Karen's claims were baseless and her actions were destructive. I was wrong. Karen had spent the week between our confrontation and the meeting working on the other HOA members. She had visited them at their homes, called them on the phone, and sent emails filled with carefully crafted arguments about community resources and property rights. By the time the meeting started, she had successfully painted me as a selfish property owner who was hoarding recreational resources that could benefit everyone. "The issue is not really about property lines," she explained to the assembled group, her voice carrying the reasonable tone of someone trying to solve a community problem. "The issue is about what kind of neighborhood we want to live in. Do we want to be a community where resources are shared for everyone's benefit? Or do we want to be a place where people build walls around their property and refuse to let their neighbors enjoy the natural beauty that surrounds us?" It was a masterful manipulation. She had turned my defense of private property rights into an attack on community spirit. Several of the newer residents were nodding along with her argument, apparently convinced that I was the problem. Jim Rodriguez, our HOA president, looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mrs. Miller, I appreciate your enthusiasm for community building, but property rights are pretty clear in Texas. If Mr. Johnson says these are private trails on his private property, then that is what they are." "Of course," Karen agreed readily. "I am not disputing property ownership, but I am asking whether there might be opportunities for neighborly sharing that would benefit everyone. Surely Mr. Johnson does not use all of those trails all the time. Would it really be such a burden to allow families with children to enjoy them occasionally?" The framing was brilliant. She had made it sound like she was asking for a small favor rather than demanding unlimited access to my property. She had also introduced the idea of children, which made any opposition seem heartless. I stood up to present my case, but I could already feel the mood of the room. "These trails represent 23 years of my time, effort, and money. I built them, I maintain them, and I am responsible for any injuries or damages that occur on them. Opening them to public use would create liability issues that could bankrupt me if someone got hurt. Liability issues can be addressed with proper waivers and insurance," Karen replied smoothly. "The real question is whether we want to be a community that finds solutions to problems or a community that hides behind excuses." She had turned my legitimate concerns about legal liability into evidence of an uncooperative attitude. I realized I was losing an argument that should have been straightforward, and it was happening because Karen was a more skilled manipulator than I was a defender of my own rights. The meeting ended without resolution, but Karen had achieved her real goal. She had created doubt about whether my position was reasonable and planted the idea that community access to my trails was a legitimate discussion rather than a clear violation of property rights. Over the following weeks, Karen escalated her campaign on multiple fronts. The ATV invasions became more frequent and more destructive. She recruited additional riders from outside our HOA, turning my property into a destination for people who had no connection to our community. They rode through my trails as if they owned them, leaving trash, damaging fences, and showing no respect for the environment they were destroying. Karen also began a whisper campaign against me throughout the neighborhood. She spread rumors that I was planning to fence off sections of County Road, that I was trying to claim ownership of public lands, and that I had threatened her children. None of these claims were true, but they were repeated often enough that some people began to believe them. The emotional toll was devastating. I had lived in this community for over 2 decades. These were people I had helped during emergencies, people whose children I had watched grow up, people I had considered friends. Watching them turn against me based on Karen's lies was almost as painful as watching my trails be destroyed. I tried reaching out to individual HOA members to explain my position, but Karen had poisoned too many wells. She had convinced them that this was a David versus Goliath story, with her playing the role of the small homeowner fighting against a wealthy landowner who wanted to deprive families of outdoor recreation. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in late October. I was working in my garden when I heard the familiar sound of ATV engines approaching. This time, there were 8 vehicles, and they were not just riding through my trails. They had brought a picnic lunch and were setting up what appeared to be a regular camping area near my creek. I called the sheriff's department to report trespassing, but the deputy who responded seemed confused about the situation. Karen had apparently been spreading her story to local law enforcement as well, describing the situation as a neighbor dispute rather than clear-cut trespassing. "Ma'am," the deputy said to me after speaking with Karen, "it sounds like you folks need to work this out through your HOA. I cannot arrest people for a civil property dispute." Karen had successfully convinced even law enforcement that this was a gray area rather than a black and white issue of property rights. I realized that I was completely on my own and that traditional channels of justice were not going to help me. That night, I sat on my porch and listened to ATV engines roaring through my trails until nearly midnight. The sound echoed across the valley like a declaration of war. Karen had made it clear that she intended to take my trails by force, and she had successfully neutralized every authority figure who might have stopped her. It was time to stop playing by rules that only I was following. It was time to fight back with methods that Karen would understand and respect. It was time to get creative. The idea came to me at 3 in the morning, born from a combination of desperation, rage, and intimate knowledge of my own property that Karen had never bothered to acquire. I was lying in bed, listening to the distant sound of ATV engines that seemed to run through my dreams even when they were not actually running through my trails, when I remembered something important about the legal requirements for community trail access. Karen had been citing HOA bylaws about recreational facilities, claiming that my trails qualified as community resources. But there was one crucial detail she had missed in her legal research. According to both county regulations and HOA requirements, any trail system designated for community use had to provide reasonable access to all areas of the property it traversed. You could not pick and choose which parts of a trail system to make public while avoiding the less desirable sections. This gave me an idea that was so perfectly devious I actually smiled for the first time in weeks. My property included not just the scenic trails that Karen coveted, but also working areas of the ranch that were far less appealing to recreational riders. In particular, there was a large pigsty operation on the north side of my land, where I raised heritage breeds for local farmers' markets. The pigs were healthy and well cared for, but like all pig operations, the area around their enclosures was muddy, smelly, and not exactly what most people would consider recreational paradise. The current trail system had been designed to avoid the pig area entirely, winding through the more scenic parts of the property. But there was no legal or practical reason why a trail system could not be rerouted to include working areas of the ranch. In fact, many agritourism operations specifically highlighted working farm areas as educational and authentic experiences. I spent the next day surveying my property with fresh eyes, looking for ways to create a trail system that would technically satisfy any legal requirements for community access, while making the actual experience far less appealing to casual riders. The beauty of the plan was that it would be completely legal and technically compliant with everything Karen had demanded. I called my lawyer, David Chen, who had handled my property purchases and estate planning for years. I explained the situation and my proposed solution, being careful to present it as a property management decision rather than a revenge plot. "You want to reroute your trails to include the pig farming area?" he asked, sounding puzzled. I want to create a comprehensive ranch experience trail that showcases all aspects of my agricultural operation, I replied carefully. If these trails are going to be treated as community resources, then they should provide an authentic educational experience that includes the working elements of the ranch, not just the pretty parts. David was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him working through the legal implications. From a liability standpoint, that would actually be better, he said finally. Working farm tour are a recognized recreational activity with established insurance frameworks. And if someone is going to claim community access rights, having a trail that includes all aspects of the property would be more defensible than one that cherry-picks scenic areas. He agreed to research the specific requirements for community trail access and help me document the rerouting decision in a way that would be legally bulletproof. The key was to make sure that everything I did was not just legal, but clearly justified as responsible property management. The physical work of creating the new trail route took me 3 weeks of evening and weekend labor. I was careful to maintain the fiction that this was a normal ranch management decision, even though every shovelful of dirt felt like a small victory against Karen's invasion. The new trail system was actually longer than the original one, winding through areas of the property that had previously been inaccessible to recreational users. It included educational stops at the cattle operation, the hay storage areas, and yes, the pig farming facility. The trail through the pig area was perfectly safe and well-maintained, following proper agricultural guidelines for visitor access. But it was also muddy, aromatic, and definitely not the scenic playground that Karen had been expecting. I installed proper signage along the new trail route, explaining the various agricultural operations and their importance to sustainable farming. I even added a small pavilion near the pig area where visitors could rest and read educational materials about heritage breed conservation. From a legal standpoint, I had created a model agritourism trail that any county inspector would approve. The masterstroke was making sure that the new trail system was the only route that provided the comprehensive property access that would be required for any community use designation. The old scenic trails were now classified as maintenance roads for ranch equipment, while the new educational trail was the designated recreational route. I spent another week documenting everything with photographs, surveys, and official filings with the county. I wanted to make sure that when Karen discovered the change, she would have no legal recourse whatsoever. I had given her exactly what she claimed to want: full community access to a comprehensive ranch trail system that showcased all aspects of my agricultural operation. The fact that this included wading through pig mud was simply an authentic element of the ranch experience. On a Friday evening in mid-November, I completed the final preparations for the trail rerouting. I installed gates that redirected the old trail entrances to the new route, posted official signs explaining the change, and sent certified letters to all HOA members announcing the availability of the new comprehensive ranch experience trail for community use. Karen was about to get exactly what she had asked for. I could hardly wait to see her reaction when she discovered that community access to my trails now included a mandatory tour of my pig farming operation. Justice, I reflected, sometimes has a very distinctive aroma. The moment of truth arrived on a crisp Saturday morning in late November. I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise, when I heard the familiar sound of ATV engines approaching from the county road. Karen and her crew had apparently decided to start their weekend with another unauthorized trail ride through what they considered their personal playground. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and I positioned myself at the kitchen window where I could observe the entire drama about to unfold. Karen was leading her usual group of 6 riders, including her husband and several people I did not recognize. They drove confidently toward the old trail entrance, clearly expecting another day of consequence-free trespassing. The first sign that something had changed was when they reached the gate that had previously opened directly onto the scenic Oak Grove Trail. Instead of the familiar path, they found a new wooden sign that read Comprehensive Ranch Experience Trail, Educational Agritourism Route. All visitors must follow marked path. I watched Karen stop her ATV and study the sign with obvious confusion. She looked around, apparently trying to figure out if she had taken a wrong turn. After a few minutes of discussion with the other riders, she decided to follow the new trail markers, probably assuming that I had simply improved the signage on the existing route. The new trail started innocuously enough, winding through a pasture area where my cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. The riders seemed pleased with this section, and I could see Karen pointing out features to her companions, as if she was giving a tour of her own property. But as the trail continued, it began to diverge significantly from the scenic route they were expecting. Instead of heading toward the Oak Grove, the new path led toward the working areas of the ranch. The first stop was the hay storage facility, where massive round bales were stacked in long rows. This was functional but not particularly exciting for recreational riders. From there, the trail led to the cattle feeding area, where the morning feeding routine was in full swing. The smell of silage and cattle manure became noticeable, and I could see the riders beginning to look less enthusiastic about their adventure. But the real revelation was still ahead. The trail markers led them inexorably toward the north side of the property, where my pig farming operation was located. As they crested a small hill and saw what lay ahead, I watched Karen's body language change dramatically. She stopped her ATV and stared at the sight before her. The pig area was clean and well-maintained, meeting all agricultural standards for animal welfare and environmental compliance. But it was also unmistakably a working farm facility, complete with mud wallows, feeding troughs, and the unmistakable aroma that comes with raising pigs in a natural environment. The trail led directly through the middle of the pig facility, following a raised boardwalk that I had constructed to provide safe passage for educational tour. The boardwalk was perfectly safe and met all liability requirements, but it also meant that anyone using the trail would spend at least 10 minutes walking slowly through the most aromatic part of my entire property. I watched Karen turn off her engine and wave frantically for the other riders to stop. Even from a distance, I could see that she was upset. She pulled out her phone, presumably to call me, but I had already decided not to answer any phone calls that morning. If she wanted to discuss the new trail system, she could do it in person. After several minutes of animated discussion among the riders, Karen made the decision to proceed. I assume she thought the pig area was just a brief detour before the trail returned to the scenic sections she was expecting. She was wrong. The trail through the pig facility was followed by a section that wound through the compost area, where I processed organic waste from the ranch. This was also educational and agriculturally important, but it added additional layers of organic aroma to the recreational experience. From there, the trail led to the equipment storage area, where tractors and implements were parked in neat rows. This section was dry and relatively odor-free, but it was also completely lacking in the natural beauty that had originally attracted Karen to my property. The final section of the new trail system was perhaps the most brilliant part of my plan. Instead of ending at a scenic overlook or peaceful rest area, The trail concluded at the working entrance to my ranch, where delivery trucks brought feed and picked up livestock. It was a practical and logical endpoint for an educational farm tour, but it was also about as far from a recreational paradise as you could imagine. I watched the group of riders emerge from the trail system, looking confused, frustrated, and distinctly aromatic. They had spent over an hour following a route that was technically a comprehensive ranch experience, but was nothing like the scenic recreational ride they had been stealing from me for months. Karen's reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. She drove her ATV directly to my front door and began pounding on it with obvious fury. When I finally answered, her face was red with rage, and her clothes carried the distinctive scent of her educational farm experience. "What the hell did you do to the trails?" she demanded, abandoning any pretense of neighborly politeness. "I improved them," I replied calmly. "The new trail system provides comprehensive access to all areas of the ranch, just like you requested. It is now a proper educational agritourism experience that showcases sustainable agriculture practices." "This is sabotage," she screamed. "You deliberately routed the trail through the disgusting parts of your property." "I routed the trail through the working parts of my ranch," I corrected. "Agriculture is not disgusting, Mrs. Miller. It is the foundation of our food system. I thought someone interested in rural living would appreciate an authentic farm experience." Karen's meltdown was spectacular. She accused me of everything from property damage to intentional harassment. She threatened to sue me, to report me to county authorities, and to have me thrown out of the HOA. But beneath all the bluster, I could see the dawning realization that she had been completely outmaneuvered. The other riders had already left, apparently deciding that their recreational activity was no longer worth the aromatic experience it required. Karen's husband looked embarrassed and kept trying to pull her away from my door. Even her most loyal supporters seemed to understand that the game had changed in a fundamental way. As Karen finally drove away, still shouting threats over the noise of her engine, I felt a deep satisfaction that I had not experienced in months. I had not violated any laws, damaged any property, or harmed any person. I had simply given Karen exactly what she claimed to want: full access to a comprehensive ranch trail system. The fact that this access now included a mandatory tour of my pig farming operation was simply an authentic element of the agricultural experience she had demanded. The aftermath of Karen's aromatic education was swift and decisive. Word spread quickly through our small community about what had happened, and the reaction was not what Karen had expected. Instead of sympathy for her plight, most people found the situation hilarious. The idea that someone who had been stealing recreational access to private property had been forced to march through a pig farm struck many of my neighbors as perfect poetic justice. Karen's ATV brigade completely disappeared after that first experience with the new trail system. None of her recruited riders showed any interest in returning for another comprehensive ranch experience, no matter how much Karen pleaded with them. The recreational playground she had tried to create on my property had become a working farm tour that required commitment and genuine interest in agriculture. Karen made several attempts to rally HOA support for forcing me to change the trail system back to its original configuration. She argued that I had acted in bad faith and that the new route was deliberately designed to discourage use. She was absolutely correct on both counts, but she could not prove that anything I had done was illegal or inappropriate. My lawyer had done his homework thoroughly. The new trail system met all requirements for community access, provided comprehensive coverage of the property, and included educational components that actually enhanced its value as a recreational resource. The County Agricultural Extension Office even offered to include my ranch in their official agritourism directory. When Karen demanded that the HOA force me to restore the original scenic trail system, Jim Rodriguez finally put his foot down. "Mrs. Miller, this has gone on long enough," he said at the December HOA meeting. "Mr. Johnson has provided community access to his property, just like you requested. The fact that you do not like the route he chose is not grounds for demanding changes to his private property management decisions." Karen's influence in the community began to collapse as people realized how far she had overreached. The newer residents who had initially supported her began to understand that property rights were fundamental to rural living, and that Karen's aggressive tactics threatened everyone's security. Several people approached me privately to apologize for doubting my position and to express appreciation for how I had handled the situation. The most satisfying moment came when Karen announced her resignation from the HOA board at the January